Most people spend their entire lives reacting. Something happens and they react. Someone says something and they react. A plan falls apart, a relationship ends, a door closes, and they react. They move through decades of their existence driven entirely by whatever the world throws at them next, with no anchor, no filter, no philosophy to stand on. And then one day, usually much later than it should have been, they stop and look back at the trail of decisions behind them. The relationships they destroyed in moments of anger, the opportunities they buried under fear, the years they spent chasing things that never gave them what they actually wanted, and they feel something that is almost impossible to describe. It is heavier than regret. It is the weight of a life lived without understanding. The Stoics knew this weight. They wrote about it. They warned about it. Marcus Aurelius, a man who ruled the most powerful empire in the known world, who held more authority than almost any human being in history, spent his private hours writing to himself about the dangers of a life lived without clarity. Epictetus, a man who was born into slavery and had everything taken from him before he was old enough to choose anything for himself, built an entire philosophy around the one thing no one could ever strip away from him, his mind. Seneca, a man of enormous wealth and influence who watched everything around him dissolve again and again, wrote letters about the only kind of richness that time cannot steal. These were not abstract thinkers sitting in comfortable rooms constructing theories. These were men who had suffered, who had lost, who had looked directly at the hardest parts of human existence and come back with something worth holding on to. What they came back with was not a system of rules. It was not a list of habits. It was a way of seeing. And when you truly absorb it, not just read it, but let it reshape the way your mind processes everything, it does not simply make you calmer. It makes you fundamentally different. It changes what you notice. It changes what you fear. It changes what you pursue and what you walk away from without looking back. You are watching Stoic Zeno. If this kind of content speaks to something in you, if you have ever felt like you were living inside a fog and sensed there was a clearer way to move through the world, then stay until the end of this video. What you are about to hear took centuries of human suffering to produce. It was not written in peace. It was written in the middle of war, illness, exile, and grief. That is exactly why it still holds. If this video gives you even one thing you carry forward, leave a like. It takes a second and it tells us that this kind of work matters. Share it with someone who needs it. Sometimes the right words at the right moment change a person's entire trajectory. And if you are not yet subscribed to Stoic Zeno, do that now. We are building something here and you belong in it. Now, 9 lessons. The kind that do not arrive gently. The first lesson is this. Almost everything you suffer is something you are doing to yourself. This is not easy to hear. It is much more comfortable to look outward, to point at circumstances, at other people, at the particular cruelty of your situation, and say that the pain came from out there. And sometimes it did. Things happen to people. Real harm, real loss, real injustice. The Stoics never denied that. But what they noticed with extraordinary precision is that the event and the suffering are not the same thing. They are separated by something. And that something is the interpretation your mind produces in the moment between what happened and how you feel about it. Marcus Aurelius wrote that you have the power to strip away many superfluous troubles that exist entirely in your own judgment. Not in reality. In your judgment. The world hands you a fact. Your mind immediately wraps that fact in a story, a meaning, a catastrophe, a personal attack, a confirmation of your worst fears about yourself. And then you suffer the story as though it were the fact itself. But the story is yours. You constructed it. You can examine it. Think about the last time you felt genuinely humiliated. Not harmed. Humiliated. Someone said something or didn't say something, or looked at you a certain way or failed to acknowledge you in the way you needed, and you felt it like a wound. But where exactly was the wound? The words were just sounds. The look was just light reaching your eyes. The humiliation, that sharp twisting thing in your chest, that was built entirely inside you, not by you on purpose but by you nonetheless, which means it is yours to dismantle. The Stoics called this the discipline of assent. Before you agree to your own interpretation of something, before you hand it your full emotional weight, pause, examine it. Ask whether what you are suffering is the actual situation, or the story your mind immediately wrote about the actual situation. In most cases, if you are honest, it is the story. And stories, unlike facts, can be rewritten. This does not make you cold. It does not make you indifferent to genuine pain. It makes you precise about what is actually hurting you, which is the only way you ever learn to stop it. The second lesson is the one that most people resist most violently. You cannot control what other people think of you, and the attempt to do so will consume your entire life. Most of what you do each day is not actually done for you. It is performed for an audience that is largely imaginary, whose approval you are constantly seeking, whose judgment you are perpetually trying to manage. You wear certain things, say certain things, hold back certain things, position yourself in certain ways. All of it filtered through the silent question of how it will be received by people who are mostly too absorbed in their own performance to notice yours. Epictetus was unambiguous about this. He said that if you are going to live according to nature, which he considered the foundation of everything, then you must give up caring about what is in other people's power to give or withhold. Their opinion of you is not in your control. It never was. You can perform perfectly and still be misunderstood. You can be generous and be accused of selfishness. You can be honest and be called a liar. The external verdict on your character has always been entirely outside your jurisdiction. What is inside your jurisdiction is who you actually are, what you actually do. The choices you actually make when no one is watching, when there is no audience to perform for, when the only judge is the one inside your own chest. Stoicism calls this virtue, and it means something very different from the soft, pleasant word it has become in modern usage. Virtue in the Stoic sense is not being nice. It is not being agreeable. It is acting in alignment with your deepest understanding of what is right, regardless of whether that earns you applause or condemnation. When you stop managing your image and start building your character, something extraordinary happens. You become, for the first time, genuinely free. Not the freedom of doing whatever you want, the freedom of not needing anyone's permission to be who you are. The third lesson will sit uncomfortably with almost everyone who hears it. Comfort is not your reward. It is your cage. The modern world has constructed an extraordinary infrastructure of ease. You can have almost anything you want delivered to you without moving. You can eliminate every form of discomfort, physical, emotional, social, with enough money and enough technology. And the implicit promise of this entire system is that comfort is the destination. That the point of working hard, of achieving things, is to arrive at a place where nothing is difficult anymore, where everything is smooth and warm and frictionless. Seneca watched the wealthy men of his time pursue this exact dream, and he wrote about what they found when they arrived. Not peace, not satisfaction, a particular kind of dullness that gradually shaded into despair, because the human animal was not built for softness. It was built for resistance. It was built to push against things, to struggle with things, to overcome things. When you remove all resistance from a life, you do not create paradise. You create a slow, comfortable stagnation. The Stoics practiced deliberate discomfort. They fasted not because food was unavailable, but because they wanted to know that hunger did not own them. They wore thin clothing in cold weather not to suffer, but to prove to themselves that they could. They voluntarily chose the harder path, the more difficult conversation, the less comfortable seat, not as punishment, but as maintenance, as a way of keeping alive in themselves the knowledge that they could withstand more than their current circumstances required. You do not have to be an ascetic. You do not have to reject warmth or pleasure or rest. But if you have arranged your life so that every discomfort is immediately eliminated, every challenge is immediately softened, every hard thing is immediately avoided, then you are not living, you are dissolving. And the thing that dissolves with you so gradually you barely notice is your capacity to handle anything real when it arrives. The fourth lesson is the one that carries the most urgency, though it is the one most consistently ignored. Time is the only resource you cannot recover. Every other loss in your life is at least theoretically recoverable. You lose money and you can make more. You lose a relationship and you can build another. You lose health and sometimes you can regain it. You lose an opportunity and another one eventually appears. But the hours of today, they are gone, not resting somewhere waiting to be reclaimed. Gone in a way that is absolute and non-negotiable. Every hour you spend in distraction, in resentment, in procrastination, in the management of other people's opinions of you, that hour is spent. Permanently. Seneca opens one of his most devastating letters with a line that has not lost a single gram of its weight in 2,000 years. He says that we are not given a short life. We receive a long one and make it short. We waste it, he says, with extraordinary generosity. We give it away to idleness, to anxiety, to trivial pursuits, to the opinions of people who will not remember us in 20 years. And then, when very little of it remains, we finally realize what we were squandering, and we call it a short life because we cannot bear to call it what it actually was. Think about the last week. Not in judgment, but in honesty. How much of it was spent on things that will matter to you in a year, in 5 years? How much of it was spent in the kind of presence and intentionality that you would choose if you knew, really knew, in your body and not just as an abstract fact, that your time was limited? Most of us know intellectually that we will die. Very few of us live as though we believe it. The Stoics believed it. They wrote about it constantly, not to frighten themselves but to stay awake. This is what memento mori actually means. Not a morbid fixation on death, a daily deliberate reminder that the present moment is not a rehearsal, that the hours are genuinely irreversible, and that living carelessly is a form of waste so profound it constitutes its own kind of tragedy. The fifth lesson is harder to apply than to understand. The things you think you need are mostly things you have been convinced to want. Desire, in the Stoic framework, is not the problem. The problem is desire that has been misdirected. Desire that has been aimed at things outside your control, at things that are fragile and temporary, at things whose loss will devastate you precisely because you built your sense of security on top of them. A man who needs approval to feel worthy is at the mercy of everyone he meets. A man who needs wealth to feel safe will never feel safe enough. A man who needs a particular outcome in order to feel at peace will never find peace, because outcomes are never entirely in his hands. Epictetus called this the difference between things that are up to us and things that are not. And his list of things that are not up to us is longer and more uncomfortable than most people want to accept. Your body, your reputation, your possessions, your relationships, your circumstances. Not one of these is fully within your control. They can be influenced, shaped, worked toward, but they can be taken. Any of them, at any moment. And if your sense of self depends on any of them remaining intact, then your sense of self is permanently vulnerable. What is up to you, entirely and without exception, is how you think, what you value, what you pursue, and how you respond to everything that happens. That is the territory of freedom. Everything outside it is borrowed from fortune, from circumstances, from the temporary alignment of conditions that could always shift. This is not a counsel of passivity. You can pursue things, build things, love people, invest in outcomes. The Stoics did all of this. But you do it with what they called preferred indifference. You prefer certain outcomes without needing them. You move toward things without being destroyed by their absence. You hold everything, including your greatest achievements and deepest loves, with open hands. The sixth lesson is the one that transforms your relationships more than anything else. You cannot change another person, and your insistence on trying is the primary source of your disappointment in them. You carry inside you a vision of who the people in your life should be, how they should behave, how they should treat you, how they should grow, change, respond, prioritize. And when the actual person consistently fails to match the ideal person in your head, which they always will, because the ideal person exists only in your head, you experience it as a personal wound, as negligence, as a failure of love or character on their part. But the Stoics would ask you to look very carefully at where the real failure is located. Because what you are doing when you require another person to change in order for you to be at peace is placing your inner state entirely in someone else's control. You are handing your well-being to a person who was never consulted on this arrangement and who has their own nature, their own wounds, their own logic. A logic that is entirely their own and that will continue operating regardless of how much you need it to be different. Marcus Aurelius, in his private writings, returned repeatedly to this theme. He was surrounded by people whose behavior frustrated him, corrupt advisors, ungrateful subordinates, petty colleagues, and he wrote to himself not about how to change them, but about how to maintain his own character in their presence. He wrote about accepting that people will act according to their nature, the way rain acts according to its nature, and that requiring the rain to be something other than wet is not wisdom. It is a form of madness dressed up as expectation. This does not mean you must tolerate everything. You can remove people from your proximity. You can decline certain relationships. You can set the terms of your own life. But you do it without the fiction that you are going to reshape another human being into the version you need them to be. That has never worked. It will never work. The energy spent on it is always stolen from somewhere more deserving. The seventh lesson is ancient, and it is the one your pride will resist the most. Your opinion, however certain it feels, is not the same thing as the truth. You have been living inside your own perspective for your entire existence. Every single thing you have ever experienced, every conversation, every event, every relationship, every piece of information has been filtered through a mind that has specific biases, specific wounds, specific beliefs about how the world works and what you deserve from it. You have never, not once, experienced reality directly. You have experienced your interpretation of reality, and your interpretation is shaped by so many invisible forces. Your upbringing, your fears, your past humiliations, your present desires, that calling it truth is the most generous possible reading. Epictetus warned against the man who is disturbed not by events but by his opinions about events. This is a statement so familiar now that it has almost lost its force. But read it again slowly. You are not disturbed by what actually happens. You are disturbed by what you think it means. And what you think it means is not a neutral, objective reading. It is a perspective. One perspective, constructed in an instant by a mind that is doing its best but is never, ever operating without distortion. The practical implication of this is enormous. Before you respond to anything with certainty, before you decide you know why someone did what they did, before you conclude that your reading of a situation is the reading, before you act on the conviction that your judgment is accurate, insert a pause. Ask yourself what you might be missing. Ask yourself what the opposite interpretation might be, and whether it has any merit. Ask yourself whether you have ever been completely certain about something, and been completely wrong. The answer, of course, is yes. Every person reading this has the experience of holding a conviction absolutely, and later discovering it was built on an incomplete picture. The Stoics called this practice of questioning your own certainties philosophical humility. It does not make you weak, it makes you accurate. And accuracy, in a world where most people are acting on distortions they mistake for clarity, is one of the rarest and most powerful things you can develop. The eighth lesson is the one that cuts deepest, because it asks you to look at something most people spend their entire lives avoiding. Suffering is not an interruption of your real life. It is part of the texture of it. Somewhere in the architecture of the modern mind is a belief that suffering is a mistake, that it represents a failure of circumstances, a failure of planning, a failure of someone or something to perform as it should have. The grief, the betrayal, the loss, the failure, these are experienced not only as painful but as wrong, as things that should not have happened, that were not supposed to happen, that indicate some fundamental unfairness in the structure of your existence. And so when they arrive, the energy goes not into processing them but into resisting them, resenting them, demanding that they make sense or make themselves useful or simply disappear. The Stoics took a completely different position. Marcus Aurelius wrote about the fire that uses whatever is thrown into it as fuel, that the great mind does not merely endure obstacles but is strengthened by them, shaped by them, made more itself through the encounter with resistance. He did not write this as inspiration. He wrote it as a practical description of what was actually happening inside him as he governed an empire in permanent crisis, as his children died, as his body failed, as the people he trusted disappointed him. He was not performing resilience. He was reporting on the mechanism. Seneca wrote that nothing happens to the wise man contrary to his expectation. Not because the wise man can predict the future, but because the wise man has fully internalized the reality that loss, difficulty, and pain are not exceptions to human experience. They are the fabric of it. When you truly accept this, not as a resignation but as a clear-eyed recognition of what living actually involves, something in your relationship to suffering shifts permanently. You stop experiencing every hard thing as evidence that something has gone wrong. You start experiencing it as part of what it means to be alive and to engage honestly with an uncertain world. This is perhaps the most liberating thing Stoicism ever gave to those who truly absorbed it. Not relief from pain, but freedom from the additional suffering of believing the pain itself was somehow unjust. The ninth and final lesson is the one that gives all the others their weight. The one that, if you sit with it long enough, reorganizes everything else. You are going to die, and most of what you are currently treating as urgent is not. This is not a dark statement. The Stoics did not intend it as one. They intended it as a corrective, a sharp, clear lens through which to view everything that is currently consuming your attention and your energy and your limited hours. When you hold the fact of your mortality not at a comfortable distance but up close, right in front of your eyes, the hierarchy of your concerns rearranges itself in ways that no amount of self-help advice can produce. The small humiliation that kept you awake last night, does it survive the lens? The resentment you have been carrying towards someone who wronged you 5 years ago, does it survive? The anxiety about what people in your social circle think about a decision you made, does it survive? Most of it does not. Most of what feels pressing and important and consuming is revealed, under the light of mortality, to be noise. Not real concerns, constructions of an ego that has forgotten it is temporary. Marcus Aurelius asked himself repeatedly, and recorded the asking in what we now call meditations, what became of everyone who came before him? The great and the celebrated and the powerful. Where are they now? Where is their urgency, their reputation, their carefully managed image? Gone, as though they never were. And he used this not to despair but to clarify. If all of it passes and all of it does, then the only thing worth doing is acting rightly, thinking clearly, treating the present moment as the irreplaceable thing it is. and spending yourself on things that have genuine meaning rather than things that merely feel urgent in the small theater of your daily life. Memento mori is not a threat. It is an invitation to wake up, to live deliberately, to stop postponing the version of yourself that you know, somewhere underneath all the noise, you are actually capable of being. 9 lessons, none of them new, all of them, in some sense, things you have already felt at the edge of your awareness, half-formed, waiting to be articulated. That is what philosophy does. It does not tell you things you have never considered. It takes what you already sense and gives it form and weight and language. It makes the invisible visible. And once you can see something clearly, you cannot unsee it. The Stoics did not promise you an easy life. They never pretended that applying these ideas would make everything smooth. What they promised was something far more valuable, a self that could not be completely undone by anything the world threw at it. A mind that remained, in the deepest sense, your own. A way of moving through existence that did not require circumstances to cooperate in order to be meaningful. That is what this channel exists to explore. Not self-help, not motivation. Philosophy, the real kind. The kind that was forged in difficulty and tested against actual suffering and passed down across 25 centuries because it worked. If this video gave you something, if even one of these 9 lessons landed somewhere real, then take 5 seconds and leave a like. It costs you nothing and it matters more than you know. If something in here sparked a thought, leave it in the comments. We read them. We want to know what landed, what challenged you, what you are still sitting with. Share this video with someone in your life who is ready for it. Not everyone is, but you probably know the one who is. And if you have not yet subscribed to Stoic Zeno, do it now. Every week we go deeper into this philosophy, not as ancient history, but as a living, applicable way of seeing everything. The Stoics are not finished speaking. As long as you keep showing up, neither are we.